Welcome to the 20th Annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition, hosted by the National Bar Association. The Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition is a contest designed to motivate high school students to excel in education. The competition encourages students to express their views on a pre-selected topic and focuses on the ability of the student to communicate orally and in writing. The contest is also designed to give young people experience in public speaking and reviewing legal documents, as well as provide an opportunity for them to obtain some financial support to continue their education. The National Bar Association's NBA First Annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition was held at its 75th Annual Convention in Washington, D.C. in 2000. As a result of the overwhelming success of the competition, the NBA, with the support of the National Bar Institute, NBI, adopted it as a national program. Please welcome to the stage President of the National Bar Association, C.K. Hoffler, Esquire.
The great and inspirational Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." Ladies and gentlemen, we believe our children are our future, and we support true education for the youth of our community. The National Bar Association invests in our young people through our Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition. The competition encourages students to express their views on the pre-selected topic and focuses on the ability of the students to communicate orally and in writing. Indeed, the National Bar Association, with the support of the National Bar Institute, adopted the competition as a national program. This year is extraordinary as we celebrate the 20th anniversary, that's right, 20 years of our inaugural competition. I'm sure our talented youth have a fantastic response to the challenging question, and that their speeches will emulate the strength and oratorical power of the competition's namesake, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful competition and best of luck to each of you, as you are our winners and you are our future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Walter Sutton, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the National Bar Institute Board of Directors. On behalf of the board, I would like to extend greetings to this virtual Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition. This competition allows high school students to hone their speaking skills. These skills will aid the students greatly as they pursue their chosen careers. The first competition was held in Washington, D.C. in the year 2000. Since that time, the National Bar Institute has awarded over 115 college scholarships to high school students. These scholarships have helped the students defray their college expenses at colleges and universities across the country. We are grateful to our corporate sponsors, to the NBA Commercial Law Section, and to Andrea Evans, the 2021 chair, for their commitment of time and resources to this competition. We would also like to thank the Planning Committee and the regional directors for their efforts in bringing this competition to fruition. Lastly, I would like to thank the parents and the students and congratulate them for their winning the regional competitions. I know that you will enjoy the students' presentations, and I look forward to seeing you in Memphis in 2022. Until that time, be well and stay safe.
The commercial law section of the National Bar Association extends its greetings to the distinguished participants of this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy competition. The mission of the NBA-CLS is to bring its outside council members together with in-house counsel who seek to increase the diversity of the bar. Over the years, it's estimated that over 1,000 section members have connected with over 100 different corporations through the CLS Corporate Counsel Conference. Expanding the pipeline of African Americans entering the legal profession is a key component of our mission. Last year, in response to the aftermath of deaths of several members of the Black community and the pervasive threat of police violence that continues to afflict our country, the NBA-CLS launched its NBA-CLS Black Lawyers Matters internship program. The program matched 24 law students with 15 different corporate legal departments and law firms, and its successes carried forward into 2021. And in furtherance of our commitment to the pipeline, we are especially thankful for the opportunity to support the Drum Major for Justice Advocacy competition. This event is designed to engage you, our little future, on important social issues. We look forward to your participation in the 20th anniversary of this amazing competition.
A special thank you to the 2021 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major Competition National Committee members. Thank you to our sponsors, National Bar Association and National Bar Association Commercial Law Section.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your judges. Judge D. Nicole Shepard, Orleans Parish, Civil District Court Judge, New Orleans, Louisiana. Judge Monty Watkins, Criminal Court Judge, 20th Judicial District, Nashville, Tennessee. Judge L. Priscilla Hall, New York State Associate Justice, Appellate Division, 2nd Department, retired. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 2021 MLK National Competition participants. Region 1, Zeta Adams, 11th grade. Region 2, Jewel Moore, 12th grade. Region 3, Xavier Alexander, 12th grade. Region 6, Jordan Green, 12th grade. Region 7, Anise Puckett, 12th grade. Region 8, Nemara Freeman, 12th grade. Region 10, Kelsey Barnes, 11th grade. Region 11, Jasmine Doyle, 12th grade. Region 12, Leah Hall, 11th grade. Please welcome your host, National Chair of the competition, Attorney Andrea Hintz Evans.
Thank you very much and welcome to this amazing competition. I want to read the question to you all. On August 28, 1963, a mass protest brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and some 250,000 others to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. What is today phrased as the March on Washington was officially known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. One specific demand of Dr. King was linked to the horror still facing us today, police brutality. As part of his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King states, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." 57 years later, citizens descended upon Washington, D.C. to address the same injustice of police brutality, and daily protests are being held throughout the nation. If Dr. King were alive today, would he support the call to defund police departments across the nation as a reform to police brutality? If so, explain why. If not, explain why. First, I'd like to welcome to the stage our first contestant from Region 1, and that's Zeta Robinson.
Thank you, judges, for having me. My name is Zeta Adams, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best. In order for there to be social justice and progress, change needs to happen. Dr. Martin Luther King made this claim years ago, yet 53 years have passed since his death, and this quote holds the same significance. Definitely more. Black civilians, specifically Black men, continue to be the prey and police the predators. When a Black man is stopped by the police, he becomes fearful, wondering if these are his last minutes on earth. They have to think back to the conversations they've had with their parents, these same conversations they've had from the ages as young as 11. Remembering to enunciate each action, to have an attitude, to talk clearly but not too loud, to be calm but not too loud, too calm, to be compliant. These are all tools that Black people are taught, and no other race or ethnicity has to deal with to the same measure. Defunding the police can allow more money to be given to areas that actually need it, like education. Dr. Martin Luther King would want to defund the police, and there's no doubt about it. The police should not have this continuous power to overpower everything else. Pacifist. A person who believes that war and violence are unjustifiable. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pacifist and believed there are other ways to solve conflict. This is exactly what defunding the police is. It's hurting the department financially, but not physically. Not even hurting them financially, because the NYPD, for example, is given $11 billion from the city's budget. This is also another reason why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a successful Montgomery bus boycott in 1956 that lasted for 381 days. This boycott stemmed from the event with Rosa Parks, where she was arrested for not giving her seat up to a white person and to sit at the back of the bus. This indeed did lead to a change in Constitution, but the fact that it took over a year to be proved unconstitutional speaks volumes. This favoritism, white superiority, and white supremacy is still here, whether it be in conversation or through the system. This is still continuing today, and it's known as systematic racism, police brutality, and just plain racism. There has always been a target on peoples of color's back when it came to the police, and it does not look like much has changed. In the 1960s and 70s, you can see videos of police officers hosing, beating with batons, using dog hounds on protesters, even if it were peaceful protests. You'd think there would be change, but no, because why in May through summer of 2020 were protesters being maced, smoke bombs being thrown, and chased for trying to protest their own rights? Now tell me something, doesn't that sound familiar? In the past 5 years alone, there has been 1,254 documented cases where an officer has shot and killed a Black man. The key word is documented because more times than not, it isn't. And that's not even counting Black women or people of color in general. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is known for his empowering speeches and actions he took as a citizen. If he were here today, defunding the police would be top priority. And that would happen with him speaking to people with higher authority like policymakers, people in legislation, and even the president. Because police officers aren't doing their jobs. Their job is to protect and serve. That goes for any race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or any kind of identification. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted equality and racial inclusion. This is what he fought for. And if defunding the police puts us closer to that goal, then that's exactly what needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeta. Next up from Region 2, we have Jewel Moore.
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Ironically, the same overzealous and deadly police acts that led to Dr. King's statement in his I Have a Dream speech nearly 58 years ago are still occurring today. Despite the centuries-long concern of police brutality in America, I do not believe that Dr. King would support defunding the police. The definition of defunding the police is to divest funds from police departments and to reallocate those funds into non-policing forms of public safety. Through the years, police officers have operated off of fear rather than fact, leading to the senseless killing of Black Americans. The slave patrols of 1704 were the first instance of law enforcement authorized to use excessive force to control Black people, and their terror lasted until 1865 and the abolishment of slavery. Post-slavery, police were given explicit orders to keep free Black people in line, frequently harassing them for freedom papers and incarcerating them for petty crimes. Does this sound familiar? 2014, Eric Gardner, killed for selling loose cigarettes. 2020, George Floyd, murdered over allegedly passing a counterfeit bill. More recently, April 21st, 2021, Andrew Brown Jr., slaughtered by North Carolina deputy sheriffs attempting to execute a warrant for his arrest, which alleged that he unlawfully possessed and was attempting to sell just 3 grams of cocaine. All nonviolent crimes, which sadly led to these 3 Black men being added to the centuries-long list of unarmed Black Americans to be slaughtered by the police. The insensitivity and disregard that white police officers have for Black lives is not a new phenomenon. Today, we have social media and primetime television, which force us to relive and review the atrocious conduct of law enforcement around the clock. In the words of actor Will Smith, racism is not getting worse, it is getting filmed. While the vast majority of the 800,000 members of law enforcement abide by their oath to protect and serve the communities they patrol, the egregious conduct of the rogue police officers serves as a contradiction to Dr. King's vision. Dr. King would have used the bargaining power associated with the concept of defunding the police to leverage modern movements towards addressing these issues, as he understood that social reform and economics are inextricably bound. He demonstrated this connection during the Montgomery bus boycotts, where he organized 40,000 Black people to stop riding the bus. This had such a crippling effect on the bus company. They faced a 75% loss of revenue, forcing them to eliminate their previously accepted policy of requiring Black people to sit in the back of the bus. Dr. King understood the economic leverage that Black people held, and he used it to bargain for social change. Not only did Dr. King speak of police brutality in his speeches, he spoke of using the power of the vote to influence policies, as did other leaders such as New York State Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. They had both recognized that through our hands, we have the power to vote, to change procedures as we see fit. And today, with our hands, we have empowered people in both the state and federal government to change how the law treats Black people. The most progressive efforts to reform how the law treats Black people have come as a result of Black people being elected to higher office. In 2014, President Barack Obama created the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. This task force consisted of law enforcement officials, academics, and civil rights activists. The force released recommendations to develop better policing practices, including more reasonable methods than defunding the police, such as increasing police training in areas of cultural sensitivity. A prime example of this power is in my home state of New York, where both the New York State Senate and Assembly are led by Black people who pushed for changes in criminal justice, which resulted in the Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2020. This act influenced changes related to policing, including a requirement of the disclosure of police disciplinary history, a requirement of body cameras, and a requirement that local municipalities prepare a citizen-based exploration program of police reforms and other criminal procedures. These examples of reforms are the answers to Dr. King and other leaders' calls for changes against the oppressive policing of Black people in America. When used as a threat against the police, defunding law enforcement puts a target on the backs of Black men and women each and every day. Dr. King was a believer in civil disobedience, and if resources for the police are diminished, lawlessness would certainly prevail, which is not a part of his legacy. Dr. King's legacy is effecting change through leveraging movements towards addressing the issue of police brutality. His legacy is electing Black people into positions of higher power so that they can make the changes that we want to see. He would not want to support defunding the police, as he would want the police to be held accountable for their actions. Black people and police officers fear one another. And where there is fear, there will never be order. And where there is no order, there will never be peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Jewel. Next up from Region 3, we have Xavier Alexander.
Good evening. My name is Xavier Alexander. I'm a rising freshman at Howard University by the way of New Jersey. As I close my eyes, I can hear no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. As the crowd chants, Dr. Martin Luther King, standing frail, but determined at the age of 91 years old, approaches the podium slowly and waves his hand to motion the crowd to be quiet. It was like we were in church. Dr. King paused and then said, "Today, April 20th, marks a day in history that I dreamed would not still be present in 2021. Birmingham, Alabama, where I joined the revolution to demand that police brutality must stop. And now we are still living in a nation, and nearly 6 decades later, is faced with police brutality that resembles my younger years. Our fight is not over. We must continue to end police brutality. We can never be satisfied," he said. As long as a Negro is victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. When he spoke, he appealed to the audience. Dr. King quieted a crowd of 250,000 people, much like he did in 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. is a hero and a father of the civil rights movement. He has streets, schools, and buildings named after him. His method of protest was through peaceful protest. I do believe Dr. King will support the call to defund the police. Defunding the police means reallocating money from policing to other agencies funded by local municipalities in effort to restore our nation. Accountability is required by all. That is law enforcement, government officials, communities, and individuals of all races and genders to make steps forward, restoration and liberation. The death of minoritized groups continues to shock our world, nation, and communities. These individuals matter because they are human and are important, old, young men and women. For this, Dr. King would question and demand to defund the police based on how it's currently structured. This does not mean that Dr. King would not call for law and order. Rather, reorganize the funding to transform justice that focuses on humanity first and death as the last option. I believe Dr. King would agree that too much money is being spent on a system that was never created with justice for all. It is my belief Dr. King would be sad today and feel as if he failed the people. His emotions would be tied to the senseless killings of people of color by those who acted under the guise of the color of law. The adage, "We have not because we ask not." Dr. King would surmise that we've asked, and our request has fallen on deaf ears. Funding for the police has been allotted to protect and serve, but to protect and serve whom? Dr. King would assert that the funding of an institution cannot be balanced on the backs of people of color. To continue to financially support a system that has historically not treated all men equal is not only a contradiction of their oath to preserve the sanctity of the communities of which they serve and are part of, but it is also a fallacy. Dr. King would impress upon us that the deaths of Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Dante Wright, Rashard Brooks, Botham Jean, Eric Gardner, and countless people of color is proof that the system designed and structured to protect is the same system that has been designed and structured to destroy. Defunding the police will not completely solve the problem because the problem goes beyond the confines of money. No doubt King would agree that the house that has been built needs to be destroyed and rebuilt with new tools. Additionally, any remaining material must be recycled because any remnant of the old structure will ultimately taint the fabric of liberation in the new structure. A house built on irresponsibility and unethical practices will deem history to repeat itself. Dr. King's dream is still becoming a reality. Dr. King will conclude by stating that we are not where we once were, and today's pain and sacrifices will determine where we will be tomorrow. A vision delayed is not a vision denied. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier. Next up from Region 6, let's welcome Jordan Green to the stage.
Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. These powerful words of outrage were spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King during his 1963 I Have a Dream speech. If you were to play that portion of that speech today, you might just think that this was a news clip from last week. And yes, I am outraged as well. Because unfortunately for us, police brutality is an issue that our Black and Brown communities continue to be plagued with. A 2019 headline in the Los Angeles Times reads, "Getting killed by the police is a leading cause of death for young Black men in America." The article states that Black boys are 3 times more likely to die at the hands of a police encounter than their white counterparts. In fact, I remember my parents explaining why my 14-year-old brother had to be extra careful playing basketball outside in our own driveway, why he couldn't go jogging in the neighborhood that we live in. As a country, we have all been witnesses to the horrors of police brutality as it plays out in real time and on TV and social media. In 2020, there have been over 1,000 fatal police shootings in our country. I don't know about you all, but at this point, I feel like my heart can't handle anymore. Because every time I hear about another unarmed Black man being shot and killed by the police, I can't help but imagine my own brother, or my own father, or me. Our country watched as George Floyd suffocated to death. We heard him call out to his mother in his last breaths. We've tasted the bitterness of injustice and heartbreak again. In the first 2 months of 2021, there have already been over 100 fatal police shootings. But today, we still experience the emotions and challenges that Dr. King felt regarding police brutality. And he marched and protested, and so did we. Our demonstrations became global as people marched all around the world with us. We marched, sang, chanted, and held signs. Some signs said, "Black Lives Matter." Some said, "No justice, no peace." Other signs said, "Reform the police." And some said, "Defund the police." There are so many voices shouting in so many different directions. I often wonder what Dr. King would say about the progress we've made regarding police brutality. Would he support this defund the police movement? Would he be against it? The defund the police movement has been a very heavily debated topic, all the way from courthouses to barbershops. But before we can debate it, we first have to define it. Brookings Institution states, defund the police means reallocating or redirecting funding away from police departments to other government agencies. New York Times states, defund the police is generally seeking spending cuts to police forces that have consumed large parts of city budgets. And even Fox News states that the intentions of those who support defunding the police are on a spectrum. A popular argument used to support defunding the police is that it would help to eliminate police brutality. But if you look, there hasn't even been a clear or consistent definition of what defunding the police actually means. Some sources say defunding the police means allocating funds to some, limiting funds to other, or even abolishing the police altogether. But Dr. King was one of the best orators of our time because of one reason: his clear and concise language. The language Dr. King used was always distinct, coherent, and clear. And as we've seen, the defund the police movement is unclear and is often left into interpretation. And I do not believe he would support this. Defund, by definition, means to prevent from or continuing to receive funds. Dr. King knew that Black communities needed police officers in them to serve and protect. But defunding the police could cause more crimes. If funds for police were cut, there would be fewer officers to protect and serve our communities. However, Dr. King was not oblivious to the over-policing, over-profiling, and police brutality in Black communities. Dr. King states, "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." Dr. King knew that to achieve this brotherhood and unity, changes had to be made. He would not have wanted to defund the police departments in their entirety. He would have wanted to transform behaviors and reform policies. Too much focus on defunding is like a doctor who's so obsessed with the patient's symptoms that he never addresses the real cause of the illness. Too much or too little money is not the real problem of police brutality. That only focuses on the symptom. The real problem can only be solved at the core through voting and legislation and accountability and changing the hearts and minds of men and women. Yes, it's complicated. And yes, it's hard work, but it's worth it. Martin Luther King said it best. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You can't reform something that has been defunded or destroyed. That would be rebuilding. Dr. King knew that we deserve to be treated equally, as it says in our Constitution, and he was trying to hold our country to that standard. I believe that Dr. King would not support defunding the police departments across the nation. He would want to transform and reform policies. We don't have to burn the whole house down just to fix the windows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And next up, I want you all to join me in welcoming Region 7 contestant, Anise Puckett.
Good evening. I'm Anise Puckett. I am from Chicago, Illinois. In the United States, some of the first American police forces were created to control enslaved Black people. This racist mentality towards African Americans has been consistently taught in police training, which has led to disproportionate brutality and murder of minorities seen throughout America. Anecdotal evidence suggests that this may be a part of their unwritten policy. However, police brutality has been an epidemic within the United States for decades. Therefore, we discuss the question of whether or not Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support the call to defund the police and the reallocation of resources given to them. Knowing Dr. King's writings, I am certain that he would be in favor of defunding the police, and the reallocations given to them would satisfy his movement for equality. George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. Darnisha Diana Harris, December 2nd, 2012. Rodney Allen King, March 3rd, 1991. Eleanor Bumpurs, October 29th, 1984. Randolph Evans, April 5th, 1976. All victims of America's love affair with police brutality. The list of African American lives lost goes on and on. Yet this is not only a problem for the Black community. On June 18th, 2020, Andre Gardondo, an 18-year-old Salvadoran American, was shot and killed by a Los Angeles sheriff deputy. On May 8th, 2020, Yusam Muhammad, a 47-year-old American man, was shot by an Evans County sheriff deputy. On August 30th, 1999, Gideon Busage, a mentally disabled Jewish man, was shot by 4 officers at least 12 times. And a little over a decade later, on the same day, John T. Williams, a Native American woodcarver, was shot 4 times by a police officer from the Seattle Police Department. Dr. King's peaceful protest marches were plagued with violent incidents of police brutality, fully sanctioned by racist politicians seeking to maintain the de facto racist status quo while marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in protest of the murder of several young freedom riders. The protesters were met with an enclave of beatings with billy clubs, attacks by police dogs, and were sprayed with high pressure fire hoses. This one incident left a future congressman with a fractured skull, surviving for his life. And Dr. King himself, battered, arrested, and jailed for leading the peaceful protest. Even though this movement was of one of non-violent civil disobedience, I am certain that Dr. King would have wished the police had empathy and de-escalation training included in their budget. The reallocation of resources would directly translate into fewer assault weapons and vehicles, fewer police per capita, and more funds possibly going towards job training or mental health care. Dr. King would have supported this defunding of the police in order to restructure them and making them less of an armed force and the communities that they serve. He would have also supported the reallocation of police funds in order to restructure the racist mindset that has been consistently taught in the police academies. And it must start with the recruitment process. There needs to be mandatory screening and testing on all applicants to scope out any overarching bias and prejudice. Next, the training needs to include de-escalation techniques and how to detect those with mental health conditions or defects and how to properly assist them, taught by publicly trained officials. This fully equipped officer would have the mental tools, as well as the self-defense and weapons training to defend themselves in order to fully support their mission to serve and protect. Thank you.
Thank you, Anise. Next up from Region 8, let's welcome Neymara Freeman.
Good evening. My name is Neymara Freeman, and I'm from Kansas City, Kansas. Martin Luther King Jr. is a role model and a hero of many. He is still revered all across the world and honored by our country. Still now, 50 years after his murder, people still use his opinion and stature to make decisions for the betterment of the African American people. In the instance of police brutality, I believe Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support defunding the police unions in the United States. There is too much onslaught, wickedness, and death created by our police for him not to support that movement. Martin Luther King Jr., while he lived, voiced support of a police revolution, understood the foundational racism of the police, and believed in the preservation of the African American people. During Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in 1967, he addressed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta and said, and I quote, "The white man does not abide by the law. His police forces are the ultimate mockery of law," end quote. Dr. King is telling us that the police force is here to serve white men and white men only. The United States Police has never been in existence to protect and serve the minority, especially Black folks. Dr. King was very cognizant of that fact, and each protest that Martin Luther King Jr. attended or orchestrated was a real call for change. Each individual protest was a revolution and a proclamation for substantial change for Black American lives. Dr. King voiced his support for these revolutions and often critiqued the police on their behavior towards people of color. He showed support for change in police conduct and repeatedly demonstrated efforts to create that change. There is also a clear point on Dr. King's understanding of the racism found in the United States police departments. There needs to be a complete dissolution of this force because of its built and inherent racism that flows throughout the foundation. Dr. King was very aware of this foundation, as we are today, and he speaks of the heinous actions done by the police in anger and disgust. In King's letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963, he tells Reverend Stallings that, and I quote, You warmly commend the Birmingham police for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would so warmly commend the police force if you had seen its dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro boys. If you were to see them slap and kick old Negro men and young girls. If you were to observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department, end quote. Here, he explains the obvious nature of the police and their actions in Birmingham. Dr. King has a clear awareness of discrimination happening at the hands of the police. Given his awareness of this foundational racism, his support for American police had to have been almost non-existent. There is no way Dr. King could have supported an organization that so openly abused and still continues to do so African Americans and often shoots them dead in the street. Finally, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in preserving the lives of African Americans. Through every single speech, boycott, and protest, Dr. King worked to legitimize the African life in the face of America. In his interview with Mike Wallace in 1966, King tells us that, and I quote, "I contend that the cry of Black power is, at the bottom, a reaction to the reluctance of white power to make the kind of changes necessary to make justice a reality for the Negro," end quote. Justice must be a reality for Black folks, and that reality is what we need to survive here in the United States of America. As an African American man, married to an African American woman, with African American children, Dr. King had no choice but to support a movement that fought for their vestige. The United States Police is and was a threat to the African life. They have killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Black lives since the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and that number is continuing to climb every single year. Police are receiving access to military-grade weapons and are no longer members of society, but soldiers out to hunt and kill. There were often 2 sides to the conflicts that ensued because of the civil rights movement. There were the police and the strong Black Americans following the lead of Dr. King. In my eyes, the leader of the latter could not and would not support the leader of the former. In conclusion, Dr. King would support defunding the police because he supported a call for change from current police behaviors. He had a deep understanding of the foundational racism of the police and dedicated his life work in safeguarding African American lives. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had constantly stuck up for Black folks when our advocacy was needed and fought for our freedom all the way to his death. What we must not forget is that defunding the police is not a call for no police at all, but a call for the redistribution of money to possibly go to community buildings between the police and the people that they are supposed to serve. So, after doing extensive research on Dr. King's commentary on police and his stance on their involvement with the African American people, I know his support for defunding the police would be apparent. Thank you.
Nimara, thank you so much. Join me in welcoming Kelsey Barnes to the stage from Region 10.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelsey Barnes, and I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I will get ready to begin. What constitutes being a radical? Being a radical means you are someone who is seeking change to fundamental policies. Today, we see historical icons like Angela Davis and Malcolm X as being radicals. Yet, we fail to see Martin Luther King Jr. as being a radical. Furthermore, we can also see policies as being radical. We see these policies to be so otherworldly due to them going against the foundations of our very system. One prominent example we can see today is defunding the police. Defunding the police means allocating resources from police departments to other community sectors such as education systems and local infrastructure. We can imagine the support Angela Davis and Malcolm X would have had for defunding the police, yet we cannot imagine Martin Luther King Jr. advocating for this proposed reform. So I beg the question, why is that? The history we learn today about Martin Luther King is a distorted history. The version of Dr. King that is taught in schools all across America and reiterated throughout our society is an inaccurate idea. It is the idea that white Americans have chose to embrace and distribute throughout society to fit their white guilt. They have oversimplified Martin Luther King's words and actions to fit white society while simultaneously disregarding the true narrative of him that has progressed society as a whole. Yes, he often spoke of nonviolence, but we're missing the piece of him that helps us understand that he was also a heavy advocate for criminal justice reform. They have taught us that he was a figurehead for the civil rights movement. They do not mention the on-the-ground work. He was not only speaking on stages and writing thoughtful letters, he was on the front lines calling for action, and the front lines presented many atrocities. He was imprisoned. He was sprayed with high-pressure water by firefighters, and when he protested and simply lived, he was around people not only being beaten, but fatally beaten by police. But Martin Luther King Jr. wanted justice, and he sought that justice with purposeful action. When he saw his brothers and sisters being beaten, he called for criminal justice reform. When he was sprayed by firefighters, he called for criminal justice reform. When he was imprisoned, he called for criminal justice reform. They do not give us the opportunity to understand Dr. King in his entirety so we can continue to be satisfied with the current state of society. They let us believe he was not a radical who saw a change to the foundations of American society when he, in fact, was. Moreover, Martin Luther King's ideas were radical for the 1960s. They were seen as unreasonable, similar to how defunding the police is seen as unreasonable today. Ideas we see assembled today, like friendships between white and non-white children, face pushback because the idea was considered extreme. Integrated education systems were considered extreme because it did not seem logistically possible. Equitable seating on bus systems were seen as extreme because it was uncharted territory. These ideas that do not seem extreme to many today were frightening for millions in 1960. These ideas to rid the system of inequality were seen as the demise of America because they have always been ingrained in the system of America. One would not understand how the system would work without these structures because they were seen as integral to the function of American society. This is much like how defunding the police is seen in current America. The police system has been a staple of America, and many cannot imagine a society with less resource forces. So defunding the police is seen as extreme and radical. Luckily, Dr. King was too. Additionally, Martin Luther King Jr. addressed police brutality specifically during his years on the front lines. He stated, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Dr. King was not satisfied then, and he would surely not be satisfied now. Black people are still battling the overlooming, demeaning, and fatal presence of police brutality in several facets of our lives. We look on social media apps on our phones and news media on our TV to see people who resemble us losing their lives due to police brutality. George Floyd had a police officer's knee on his neck for 9 minutes. He died due to police brutality. Breonna Taylor was peacefully sleeping in her house when several police officers stormed in and shot her several times. She died due to police brutality. Tamir Rice was playing with a toy gun on the playground when he was fatally shot by a police officer. He died due to police brutality. Eric Garner was selling cigarettes on the street before he was choked by a police officer. He died due to police brutality. Martin would not be satisfied by a system where people are still screaming, "I can't breathe." Martin would not be satisfied with a system where Black children are afraid to go to school, afraid to go to the grocery store, afraid to live. Martin would not be satisfied with a system where his Black brothers and sisters are not free at last. So when we come to the question, would Martin Luther King Jr. have supported defunding the police? The answer is a definitive yes, because he was a radical who would have sought any viable options to free his Black brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Next up from Region 11, let's welcome Jasmine Doyle to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I want to take this time to thank the National Bar Association and the honorable judges for this opportunity. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. These are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech that still ring true today, and one step towards satisfying that goal be defunding the police. Now, what does it mean to defund the police? Is it a knee-jerk reaction with no research? Is it a way to abolish the police force and let chaos reign supreme? No. What defunding the police actually means is demilitarizing and reallocating funds to things like training to avoid violent situations, education, housing, and other social services. Police brutality is a national crisis that is disproportionately affecting the African American community. If Dr. King were alive today, he would be heartbroken that the issue of police brutality is still affecting this country, especially after the fighting and protesting for equality. This cry for help from the people is not a new trend, but a serious issue that has been going on since the creation of the organized police force. To better understand the movement of defunding the police, you must understand their history. One of the first forms of policing was the creation of slave patrols in 1704 in the Carolina colony. This was a practice used to chase runaway slaves and put an end to slave riots. This was in place until the end of the Civil War, the early Reconstruction. But although these slave patrols were disbanded, these same patrollers became our police. Modern day police practices began in the early 1900s, and with the rise of Jim Crow and the KKK, there was no doubt that members from this organization also infiltrated policing. However, in the 60s, there was a shift in attitude specifically from African Americans and the way they were treated by police. This is why we have events like the March on Selma, which Dr. Martin Luther King was a part of in 1965. Hundreds of African Americans were arrested for peacefully protesting for their voting rights. In 1965, we also began to see the rise of the militarization of the police with the Los Angeles Watts riots, for example. The pattern of police brutality began to grow and become rampant during the Civil Rights Movement. And now, 59 years later, we are still fighting to be treated as humans by a system that was designed from its inception to terrorize Black communities in an effort to protect private interests. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, murdered by police over a toy gun. Michael Brown, 18 years old, gunned down by police with his hands up. Akai Gurley, 28 years old, killed by police while walking down a dark stairwell. As a 17-year-old African American, I understand why these conversations, also known as the talk, about how to act around police are necessary. These incidents happened in 2014 when I was 12 years old, and 5 years later, we're hearing the same stories, but with different names. George Floyd, suffocated for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Patrick Warren Sr., shot 3 times in the chest during a mental health crisis. Breonna Taylor, shot multiple times in her own home. There are over 1,000 reports of police brutality each year, but some of those reports aren't even reported. So that number is much higher than we think. As Martin Luther King said in his letter from a Birmingham jail, you warmly commend the Birmingham police for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would quickly commend the policemen due to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department. Today, over-policing, more especially the militarization of the police in communities of color, comes with a wide range of consequences. These consequences include costly fines, criminal records, and police brutality. Not only has the police been militarized, their funding has increased exponentially. Between the years 1991 and 2019, the US population has grown 30%, but the overall police funding has grown 254%. Instead of relying on police to be mental health professionals, dealing with the homeless and possible suicides, we can reallocate those funds to things like homeless services, community development, housing, and job programs. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. left behind a legacy of peace and unity. And although the momentous stride for equality was achieved, the push to reform a system that was installed to protect us is still a challenge today. And if Dr. King were alive, he would definitely be in favor of redirecting funds away from the police department to other government agencies funded by the local municipality. Thank you.
Jasmine, thank you so much. Next up, join me in welcoming from Region 12, Leah Hall.
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity. If Dr. King were alive today, he would support the call to defund the police departments across the nation as a reform against police brutality. Dr. King believed in creating a just and equal system of law and taking action to make real change. These beliefs are shared by others calling for reform and defunding the police. The Black Lives Matter movement has existed for many years, but gained massive momentum with protests in 2020 after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths, and many, many others whose lives were taken by police brutality. It became clear to many that not only were the police and institutions created to protect the American people, failing to keep them all safe, they were also causing the lack of safety. According to CNBC, around $100 billion is being spent on policing a year. All this money is going into supporting a corrupt system. This fact has caused many people to question why the money is not going towards organizations that support communities instead. This line of thinking has also led to conversations and debates about defunding the police. Firstly, Martin Luther King Jr. would have supported the call to defund the police because he believed that the system needed change. Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent social rights activist and minister in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s. He stood for equality and justice for everyone, no matter their race. Martin Luther King fought to achieve his goals throughout his life. Yet people are still fighting for the same goals more than 5 decades after his death. During his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963 at the March on Washington, Dr. King spoke about police brutality. He said, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." His statement still rings true with respect to events occurring now with racial profiling, discrimination, and brutality in the US's criminal justice system. That quote shows that King supported standing up against police brutality, saying that we can never be satisfied unless there's a change in the system. Secondly, Martin Luther King Jr. would have supported defunding the police because he experienced the injustice in the system firsthand. Martin Luther King Jr.'s activism landed him in jail 29 times for acts of civil disobedience. Although the system tried to prevent him from speaking and advocating for change, he did not stop. The criminal justice was not working with King. It fought against him and everything he stood for. It worked exactly how it was designed because it was created to prevent true justice. Modern policing started during the American colonies with patrols designed to catch runaway slaves. The origins of policing are corrupt because their purpose was originally to control minorities and keep them down. In 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, Dr. King protested along with others against the horrible treatment of Black people in America. and for this crime, Dr. King was arrested and sent to Birmingham jail. It was there that he wrote a letter explaining his thoughts on policing. In the letter, he wrote, "I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress." This excerpt from his letter shows his vision for the justice system. Dr. King believed that a system of law and order was important, but it cannot achieve its purpose when it worked alongside injustice. The call for defunding the police has the same premise. The system today cannot continue because it has so much corruption. By defunding the police, it is possible to work towards an equal America and reform leading to a better criminal justice system. America stands for equality for all, but when its systems fail to deliver on that promise, it destroys the very institutions that America holds dear. Dr. King understood this dilemma firsthand as he had experienced police brutality and injustice in the system. Lastly, he believed that nothing would be changed without action. A changed world can be a real possibility if enough action is taken to create that change. In the letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King also wrote, "Freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. You must demand it, for it will not be given freely." This statement is a call for action. It represents the power and the passion for change shown by all the people now protesting for change in our current times. King believed that the oppressor would never allow for change by itself. People must take that action to achieve that change and ensure freedom. Dr. King's beliefs and commitment to fighting for what is right and creating a fair system are why he, in our current times, would support the call for defunding the police as a reform against police brutality. Martin Luther King Jr. sought a different America and understood that it takes radical change like defunding and reforming the police to achieve it. Thank you.
And now, announcing the winners of the 20th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition. In third place, Nimara Freeman, Region 8. In second place, Jewel Moore, Region 2. And in first place, Kelsey Barnes, Region 10. Thank you to our judges, committee members, participants, guests, and sponsors. This concludes the 20th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major for Justice Advocacy Competition.